have to make sure I'm recording. Okay, and I will do my best to get this up online later today. So the first, just like last time, right, if people ask me the questions, I bolded it. So we had this question, what was the policy of assimilation? And we're in section 5. So the policy of civilization was to make Korea an integral part of Japan / the Japanese Empire. The Japanese were not planning on leaving. They're in Korea to stay. Right? This isn't meant to be temporary. And in particular, the Koreans are to become like the Japanese. Right? The Japanese argument was, we are modern Asians. Right? We're Asians who successfully modernized, so you should imitate us and become modern. Right? To be Korean is to be traditional and backwards. To be Japanese is to be advanced and modern. That's kind of the idea. Now, in practice, though, you shouldn't be too much like the Japanese because then you threaten our power. Right? Japanese people had certain privileges in the society, in the Japanese Empire. So what ended up happening was Koreans were expected to be like the Japanese in terms of learning Japanese language and being loyal to the empire, but they were always supposed to be on the bottom. So Koreans are supposed to be like the Japanese enough to serve the empire, but not too much because then they'll be able to rise up to high positions. And this was always a tension within the Japanese Empire because basically Koreans were supposed to be like the Japanese, but they didn't want to give them privileges. So, I gave you one example was, even though they followed this policy early on, it was legal to whip or flog Koreans, but you couldn't do the same to Japanese, right? They had a separate law code. And that doesn't make sense, right? If you're going to treat if Koreans are supposed to become like the Japanese, shouldn't they have the same law code? So this was the policy. My point is it wasn't always followed, though this is what they were supposed to be doing. What are the characteristics of Japan's empire in Korea and the Japanese colony on the peninsula? What made colonization possible? So one thing I wanted us to understand that makes this different from, and I use as a comparison like British India. In Japan, there was a lot of population pressure. The Japanese population was growing, and the Japanese actually did not have enough food to feed their population. So the Japanese were looking for places for Japanese people to immigrate to settle. And so what we call Japanese colonization of Korea, we sometimes call settler colonialism. Large numbers of merchants, officials, and even farmers left Japan to go and live in Korea. And this was a huge number of people, right? This was not a small number of people. This was a significantly large amount of people. And they constituted, on average, 25% of the urban population, right? So this is a huge number of people. And they dominated the modern sector. And one reason why the assimilation policy didn't work the way it was supposed to was because they always pressured the Japanese government to prioritize their interests. So at times the Japanese government in Korea did want to treat Koreans as equals, did want to give Koreans equality or opportunities, but the Japanese people there would say, nope, we don't want that. We don't want Korean people to get a high education because then they will compete with us for jobs, right? So this is one reason why they weren't able to follow the assimilation policy the way they wanted. And I just gave you, I don't expect you to remember these numbers exactly, but I wanted you to see just how many people we're talking about, just how Japan was dominating Korea. Right? They have 87,000 officials. Now, most of them are not, or a large number of those are Korean, but most are still Japanese. But you look at this number, and we have to remember the British had as many personnel in India as Japanese had in Korea, but India had 20 times the population of India. I didn't fix that slide here, sorry. India had 20 times the population of Korea, right? Doesn't make sense otherwise. Right, India had 20 times the population of Korea. So this was serious colonization. The Japanese are here to stay. Now, what makes this possible is violence, right? What makes this possible is violence, right? This was maintained by force. There were Koreans who would work with the Japanese, but the underlying foundation of the policy was violence, was force. And I gave you examples of this about the large numbers of police. Please also note that a large number of them were Korean, right? And that's one reason why you had this trouble later on with collaboration. And remember, I showed you this picture. You may think this is a police officer. He's not a police officer. He's an elementary school teacher, and he's got a sword. Right? So that they stopped that after 1919, but they started off doing it. So this is made possible through violence, through force. What are the characteristics of Japan's empire in Korea and the Japanese? Oh, we just did that one. 5, what were the characteristics of the period of military rule? Why was Christianity such a threat? How did the government seek to control it? And as always, I have to go fast to get in as much as possible. If you want me to repeat something or if I'm going too fast, please let me know. So the period of military rule lasted from 1910 to 1919, right? This has to do with one of your essay questions, and this is one of the times I do expect you to know order and have a general idea of years. But during this time period, there was actually armed resistance in Korea until 1914. So we're still guerrilla soldiers, Korean guerrillas fighting the Japanese until 1914. After 1914, most of those guerrillas will have to either go to Manchuria or Russia. In addition, during this time period, Koreans essentially have no freedom of speech or no freedom of assembly or press or anything like that. The public sphere has serious restrictions. So for example, Korean newspapers weren't even censored. There were no independent Korean newspapers, right? The Japanese didn't bother even with censorship. They just didn't allow them to have newspapers, right, that were independent. And to show you kind of how far the Japanese were going to kind of control things, in 1911 they framed 105 important nationalists. They said these guys were guilty of a conspiracy to assassinate the Japanese governor general. And this is just false. There was no such conspiracy, and you would never have a conspiracy with over 100 people in it. That's absurd. You would never do that because someone would inform the police. But that's how far the Japanese went. Now, one thing I should point out that happened, this ended up embarrassing the Japanese because most of these people were Christians, and American and British missionaries told the rest of the world what the Japanese were doing, and this was a huge embarrassment for Japan, and they had to back off and release most of these people. Right? Only a few were actually convicted of any crime, and then they were quickly pardoned. And this goes to this next part of this question: why was Christianity such a threat? Well, there you just saw it. Right? When the Japanese tried to control these nationalists, American and British Christian missionaries told the world what they were doing. Told them, they're torturing these guys. This crime is just clearly, this is just clearly a false accusation. So and also notice most of the 105 men, they were all nationalists. The vast majority, I think over 100 of the 105, were all Protestant Christians. Right? So Christianity is a threat. Right? Because Christian missionaries can tell what's going on in Japan, or tell what's going on in Korea to the rest of the world, and Christianity, many nationalists are often Christians. They see this as a way, remember, we talked about that before, those two ideas often went together. So what happened then, so Christianity is dangerous, and for other reasons as well. It has a worldview not controlled by Japan, right? Japan emphasizes the divinity of the Japanese emperor. It has an alternative mode of modernity. Protestant Christians in particular talked about freedom, whereas the Japanese colonial government emphasized Confucian obedience, right? That's very different. Christians operated independent institutions like schools and churches, but you couldn't just crush them. Right? You couldn't just make Christianity illegal or do anything like that, because most of the missionaries were Americans or British people. Japan had an alliance with Britain. Right? So they had to be nice to British people. And Japan had to maintain good relations with the United States. So they had to be careful about what they did with Americans. So they had to be careful in their attempts to control, because if they hurt the missionaries or went after Korean Christians too much, this hurt two people that they had to make happy, the British and the Americans. So what happened is they tried to attack their institutions, right? In 1915, for example, Japan passed education reforms that said that if you have, every school has to have instruction in Japanese. Well, so if you're an American missionary, you got to learn Korean and Japanese if you want to teach in a school. That's very difficult to do. And you weren't allowed to have any religious instruction at all. Not simply required, but optional religious instruction was not allowed, even after school hours. So you couldn't even have like a Sunday school, essentially. You could have nothing. And when the churches tried to have dialogue and compromise, they were told, well, you guys need to change your religion, basically. Stop teaching Koreans to rest on Sundays, and start teaching them about photos of the emperor and empress. Right? So they can't control Christianity directly as Christians. What they do is they try and control their institutions. Right? They're going to try and take over their institutions. How did Korean concepts of the nation change during this time period? Right, question 6. Well, in the past, remember we had this problem. Whoever controlled the king controlled Korea. Right? When the Russians controlled the Korean king, they had influence. When the Japanese controlled the Korean king, they had influence. And the problem was, so that was a problem, but also the royal house, right? The dynasty, the family. What happened to them? They were basically forced to marry into the Japanese imperial house, which meant all their kids would be half Japanese. right? So, and many elite people collaborated. Many people who were in high positions in Korea decided they wanted to keep their high positions, so they worked with the Japanese. So the old aristocracy, the old kingdom were basically discredited. So what happened then was in 1917, a group of nationalist leaders got together and said that sovereignty is in the people, not the throne. Right, similar to the United States, U.S. Constitution, we the people. And this was based off of the idea of this guy, Shin Che-ho, right? He wrote a book called The Dream of Heaven, in which he had a very simple idea. He said, a country is like a human being, right? A human being has a soul and a body. A country is made up of a nation and a state. When a human being dies, their soul loses their body. Our country has been colonized, so our nation has lost its state. But if we, the Korean nation, work on, right, our spirit, if we strengthen our spirit, one day we can regain our body. Right, so that's his idea. We Koreans might have lost our country, we might have lost our government. We're no longer independent. But the Korean nation lives on, right? The Korean spirit lives on. And that Korean spirit, that Korean nation, can regain a body that is the state, as long as we strengthen it. Right, so that's why he would write books, for example, focusing on military heroes, right? To tell Koreans, we Koreans can be strong. We're not wimps. We can be strong. Question 7, what were the characteristics of the March 1st movement? What was the movement's impact? So remember, the March 1st movement occurred in March 1919, right? And that's a year I'm not going to... you want to kind of keep in mind because it's right after World War I and Woodrow Wilson's ideas of national self-determination. Woodrow Wilson said that basically any nation that wants its own state should have it, right? That's what Woodrow Wilson thought. And notice how similar that is to this idea, right? Every nation that wants its own state should have it, right? So what happened was Koreans, inspired by this, said, hey, we need to declare independence. If we show that we, the Korean nation, want our state back, the rest of the world will give it to us. Right? Japan will be put under pressure and will have to give up. They'll have to give up their empire and will become an independent country. Right? Every nation that wants a state should get one. Okay, great. We Koreans will declare our independence. That will show to the world how that will show the world that we want our own state. Japan will be under pressure to give it to us, and then we'll get it. And so Christians and Chondogyo, which is another native religious organization, through their schools and other things, other institutions organized this protest secretly. It's amazing that no one actually knew about this thing. And on March 1st, 1919, they declared independence. And I wrote religion there just because I wanted to note that even though only very few Koreans at this time officially had a religion, every one of the 33 signers of the Declaration of Independence had a religion. There were 17 Protestants, 16 members of Chondogyo, and 2 Buddhist monks. They launched massive demonstrations that would have up to 1 million people would be involved in them. And Japan reacted. The Japanese were shocked and surprised at the Koreans were able to organize this thing secretly and responded with brutality, with very large amounts of violence against crowds. There were a few times when they put people into churches and then would burn down the churches and things like that. So it was very severe stuff. I had this image, right? Does anyone remember who these ladies are? I told you. Kiseng, yeah, they're Kiseng. They became involved in the March 1st movement. Right, so these women are becoming involved in the March 1st movement. And I gave you another example. This woman, Yu Guan-soon, who you notice was a very young woman, she was someone who was from the provinces, but through her connections with Methodists was able to go to a modern school, and she actually helped organize the March 1st movement, you'll recall. And so it's fascinating, right, was that this young woman who never would have been involved in politics a decade or two before is now playing an active role, right, in politics. And I always like to say that there's a transformation. The tragedy, of course, is it kills her, right? She dies in jail because of her mistreatment. So the March 1st movement failed in its immediate goal, right? Korea does not become independent, right? The rest of the world does not help Korea to become independent. But there are several important things. First of all, it's a mass movement. This wasn't a movement of simply elite, educated people. 1 out of every 20 Koreans participated in this. And new types of Koreans were participating, right? Before we talked, we mostly focused on adult men, older men. But now we're looking at women, and young women even are participating in it. And this is based on their experience of colonization and ethnic discrimination, right? One reason why so many people participate in it is so many people are experiencing what it's like to be part of a colony, where they're ruled by a different ethnic group. And this shows us how Korean nationalism is spreading. What options were available to Koreans following the March 1st movement? And no one asked directly, but it's related to number 9, what were the characteristics of Japan's cultural policy? So what happened, I'll just briefly answer this, even though no one asked it. If you're planning on answering this for the essay, you want to look more in detail on your own. But after the March 1st movement, Japan realized that they couldn't have such a severe policy of military rule, right? The military rule of just not letting any kind of newspapers, that's too much. So the cultural policy, or what's also called cultural rule, allowed Koreans more space to discuss things. So for example, now Koreans could have their own independent newspapers, it's just that they were censored, right? Before they couldn't have any, but now they can have them, they're just censored. And clever people could get around the censorship even. So that's what happened, was there was an opening. Cultural policy is much less restrictive than the old military policy. So Koreans had a problem, right? Do we work with the Japanese to develop our country? Right? You know, there was this idea, if we develop Korea's nation, it can get back its body, its state. Well, why not just do that? And the Japanese want to do that too, so we can work with them with the idea that eventually we'll become strong enough and the Japanese will have to leave. So working with the Japanese did not necessarily mean that you were for Japanese colonialism. You could work with the Japanese to develop the nation in hopes that one day the country would be strong enough that the Japanese would have to leave. Some people said, nope, we need to work through diplomacy. Let's appeal to strong countries like the United States for help. Syngman Rhee did that, for example. Some people said, you know, we just need to preach and spread Christianity and pray and God will save us. Some people said, we need to fight. We need to have military resistance. And other people said, you know what, we should turn to communism, which was a new ideology that was kind of, well, it's new for Asia. But a big problem that they all faced was this question, right? Should we be more like Japan, the United States, or the Soviet Union? Right? What country should, in a sense, should we look like? If we get rid of Japan, who do we look like? Right? Are we a republic like the United States, a more conservative kind of republic like Japan, or do we become communist? And a lot depended on where you were, right? If you were in Korea, for example, you pretty much say we have to be like Japan. It's kind of hard otherwise. But if you're in the United States, you say let's be like the United States. If you're in the Soviet Union, you say let's be like the Soviet Union. What was cultural nationalism? What were its weaknesses? Why did communist influence Koreans criticize it? Why wasn't communism or socialism able to unite Koreans? Cultural nationalism is using that idea of Shinchi-ho, right? This idea of cultivating the nation with the idea that one day it can get its government back, right? The Korean nation develops, one day we'll be able to have a strong state. And the people attracted to this were mostly middle class, educated, capitalist, liberal, and people, and especially religious people who often were, you know, Christians at this time period tend to be capitalist and liberal. When I mean liberal, I mean they believed in kind of traditional 19th century liberalism. It's not the same thing as a liberal today. These people supported this because in a certain sense it played on their strengths and it was fairly safe. Right? You're not going to get shot, typically, writing a newspaper article. And these are educated people. They like to write. They like to teach. Those are things they're good at. And so they're going to form all sorts of associations. They're going to make newspapers and magazines, all which seek to develop the Korean nation. Right? All of which seek to somehow develop the Korean nation. So, for example, one thing they want to do is standardize the language. I think I mentioned this in class. Koreans today would struggle to read something written in the 1920s or 30s. For Americans, it's not hard. You can read something written in the 1920s and 30s, no problem, because our language was standardized. In this time period, Hangul was not standardized. So they would have associations to teach people proper Hangul. They would have newspaper articles saying this is the correct way to write in order to develop the nation. Right? If we Koreans can't understand each other, how can we become independent? They also did things like supporting, like I said, education, but also industry. And one example I gave you in particular was the Buy Korean movement of Cho Man-sik. Right? He comes up in section 6 as well. He was a northern Christian, so he's from North Korea, what's today North Korea. And he said, you know what, we need to develop the Korean industry. We can do that by encouraging people to buy Korean goods. Right? You want to help Koreans develop a clothing industry, buy Korean clothing. Very simple. And this actually had a lot of success. Had some problems because it was expensive, right? Korean clothing was usually more expensive than Japanese clothing. And sometimes people were corrupt and would say something was made in Korea when it was actually made in Japan. But this would continue on. And this is kind of a typical cultural nationalist movement. Another movement was something like building a university. Cultural nationalists said, let's build a university. And they were starting to try and raise money to build one. And then the Japanese kind of stole their idea and built one, and then made sure that it was mostly for Japanese people. Very few Korean people could actually join the university. So this is one weakness of this movement. What was very easy for Japan to kind of step in and block its efforts, right? All we have, okay, the Koreans want to form their own university, we'll just build one that they can't compete with, and we'll let some Koreans in so they can't complain, but mostly it's going to be for Japanese people. Remember, there's a huge number of Japanese people in Korea at this time. In addition, communism, right? So we're moving on to the next question, right? Why did communists influence Koreans? Criticize it, and then why wasn't communism or socialism able to unite Koreans? So the history of communism in Korea is very complex because there were lots of different types of communists, because there was a rule one party for each country. So Koreans who lived in China had to join the Chinese Communist Party. Koreans who lived in Japan had to join the Japanese Communist Party. And there was also a Korean Communist Party, which was very weak because the Japanese were really good at crushing it. So what these people argued, first of all, they didn't like capitalist liberal democracy. They looked at the inequality, they looked at the economic problems in the United States and Japan and other countries and said, why do we want to be like them? They have huge amounts of poverty, right? Why should we be like them? They also often were critical of religion. So their point was, even if we got independence, we would still have all the same problems that these countries have. We would have the inequality, we would have the crime, we would have the corruption. So that's one of their big problems. And they looked at the cultural nationalism were very critical because they said, first of all, you're unrealistic. Japan is never going to leave. They've made this clear. So the idea of just building up our nation's strength so that Japan will eventually leave, that's unrealistic. It's a fantasy. In addition, this movement, you want to do things like build a university? Most Koreans will never go to university. Most Koreans can't read. Why are you wasting money and resources developing something that will not benefit the Korean masses? Right? How can we talk about a university when Koreans can't read? So, and like I said, their big criticism of cultural nationalism was basically, you guys will never be successful. Japan will never leave just by doing this. We have to actually confront Japan. But even if you were successful, which won't happen, you're going to have the exact same problems that Western liberal democracies have and that Japan has. You'll have the poverty, you'll have the corruption, you'll have all these issues. So what happened is, and I'm going to go through this really, really quickly. I don't expect you to remember all the details. But there was an attempt to unite people, cultural nationalists, people on the political right, with people on the political left, with communists and socialists. There was an attempt to unify them. The problem was, what ended up happening was the left only cooperated with the idea that it could gain control of the right in this way. And then, when it turned out they couldn't do this, when it was hurting them, the left dissolved. They forced this group to dissolve. They had a vote, and they controlled the vote, and they forced it to dissolve. So, in a sense, this criticism is very accurate. The problem is because communism and socialism were basically illegal, especially communism, they could criticize and split the movement, but they could never lead the movement. Right? They could criticize and split it, but they could never lead it. So that's a significant problem. Right? They can split the nationalist movement, so Korean nationalists will fight with each other and argue with each other and be in conflict with each other, and no group is strong enough to unify them. Right? So even though in a sense this is accurate, the communists will never be, or socialists, those people will never be able to unify the nationalist movement because they're illegal in Korea. So it's a big problem. Right? Koreans, as much as they want to, are not able to put aside their political differences. What was the provisional government? Why did it fall into factionalism? Why did Korean nationalists in Hawaii had the same problem? Well, the provisional government, right? This was right after the March 1st movement. A group of the basically capitalist, liberal, democratic Koreans met in Shanghai and set up a government to represent Korea. They said, okay, we declared independence. Now we need an independent government. It's a government in exile. It doesn't actually govern Korea, but we need some sort of official government to show that we Koreans have really declared independence. And so they set this up. The problem, of course, is they essentially had no money. right? They don't have taxes or anything like that. Where are they going to get money from, right? Remember in that video clip, we saw that Koreans in Hawaii sent them money, but I mean, that's not a whole lot of people. They're not able to get a whole lot of money that way. So they never had enough money. That makes it hard. But also they disagreed over what to do, right? Should we focus on diplomacy? Should we fight Japan? What do we do? And you can't just say, well, let's just do everything, because these are all good ideas, because you don't have enough money. So this is always the problem. And of course, there's also personal ambitions. Everyone wants to be the leader. Everyone wants to be in charge. So that encourages even more factionalism. So whenever you think of the Korean nationalist movement this time, think of division, right? They're not able to unify. You had the same problem in Hawaii, right? We looked at Syngman Rhee and his activities in Hawaii. Notice he's connected to both groups, right? He was actually president for a while of the Provisional Government until they got rid of him because of factional issues. But you had the exact same problem here, where Syngman Rhee will fight with Koreans who say, Syngman Rhee believes in diplomacy. He says, we need the help of the United States. That's expensive. You got to go to Washington, D.C., you got to buy nice clothes, you got to lobby people. That costs money. You had other Koreans who were in Hawaii who said, no, we have to train an army to fight. That's expensive too. Buying guns and uniforms and training people, that's also expensive. So there's not enough money, there's conflict over the best way to do things, and you also have issues of personal ambition. What activities did Kim Ilsung and communists undertake outside of Korea? Well, Kim Ilsung, remember, he was a communist guerrilla. That was his big thing, right? Kim Ilsung was a communist guerrilla, and he fled to Manchuria, where he would attack Japanese forces there. And he even would go into Korea, and his big claim to fame was he basically destroyed a Japanese police station that was in Korea. Right, he attacked a Japanese police station in Korea. However, you can see that's his big accomplishment, right? I mean, that's good, but that's not a lot. And he was eventually forced to flee into the Soviet Union, right? So, he was able to accomplish something, but not a whole lot. So Koreans are in a difficult position. What were the characteristics of Korean factory workers? What problems did they face? How did they resist? What identities did they have? So one thing about what happens in Korea is you have a growth in industry under the Japanese colonial period, especially when World War II begins. In North Korea, there's cheap power, there's cheap electricity, right? You may remember when I showed you the seal of North Korea, they have a dam on it. So cheap power, that's great for factories. In addition, there was cheap labor, right? Korea was poorer than Japan. People were willing to work for less money. And especially you had lots of Koreans moving to the cities looking for opportunities. So you had a pool of cheap labor. In particular, there were lots of women workers, especially in light industries like making cloth. And they worked for, what's interesting, so you have these women going into new kind of, what's the word I'm looking for? New types of occupations, but they do it for traditional reasons, right? They want to save money to marry, they want to make extra income for their family, and sometimes the family was just too poor to support them. They faced a lot of problems, just like the American Industrial Revolution. They faced harsh working conditions. To maximize profits, you don't use safety equipment. You push the employees to work as hard as possible. They were forced usually to live in dormitories so that their movement could be controlled. It was basically they worked and they went to the dorm, and maybe once a week they were allowed to go out a little bit, but only supervised. They were also forced to save money, and that may sound like a nice idea, but the idea of compulsory savings was that if they left their job, they wouldn't get the money back. And sometimes even then, the factory wouldn't let them have the money anyway. And of course, a lot of times these were poor, uneducated women. You could just trick them. You could tell them, oh yeah, you only saved, $50, when in fact they had saved 100, and they really couldn't do anything about it. And they also faced threats to their physical safety, right? Because of unsafe working conditions, and unfortunately through things like sexual harassment or even rape. They resisted sometimes by running away. That was the main form of resistance. You're treating me badly, I'm just going to run away. So the dormitories actually had jails in them. And of course, if you ran away, you lost your compulsory savings. Other times they stole. If they made clothes, they would try and steal clothing and send it to their family. You could look at that as theft, but if you're a worker who feels like they're being treated poorly, and they would just say, I'm just taking what's rightfully mine. And sometimes they had actual protests, like they would have like a strike, and this is an image of a protest. And one thing I wanted to highlight this was that people had multiple identities. They weren't simply Koreans, right? They were factory workers, they had a class identity. Some of them like farmers, peasants. Peasants weren't really worried about nationalism because they were too busy trying to survive, for example. What were the characteristics of education during the colonial period? right? Well, basically, like I said, I'm going to go quickly. Legally, Koreans were supposed to attend school. Legally, Koreans had to attend school. However, the local community was expected to pay much of the expenses themselves. And one thing that the Japanese did was they wanted Koreans to focus on learning Japanese, so that way the Japanese didn't have to, and also on vocational training. Right? The idea was they wanted Koreans to serve in lower offices in areas where Korean language was needed, especially the police. But they didn't want Koreans to compete with the better jobs. Right? They wanted Koreans to be in lower class jobs, to learn Japanese so they could be good servants, essentially. And one thing I like to use as an example, you would think the number of Korean teachers should go up as Koreans become increasingly educated. It doesn't. The number of Korean teachers actually the percentage of Korean teachers goes down, whereas the percentage of Japanese teachers goes up. And the key thing was, one thing I want to emphasize, even though it was on the books that you were supposed to attend school, by the 1930s, only 1 out of every 6 kids was actually in school that was supposed to be. So not many Koreans were actually educated. Right? The numbers were very, very low. Very few Koreans are actually going to receive an education. And like I said, there were limited opportunities for higher education for Koreans. The schools in Korea served the Japanese populations first. And actually, Koreans often went to Japan to study, right? Because of the lack of education in Korea. What's interesting is that when they would go to Japan, they learned about ideas like communism that they wouldn't normally learn about in Korea. Right, you may remember that guy who you read about in the Under the Black Umbrella. He had that experience, right, where he learned about communism in Japan. So some of these people would embrace dangerous ideas while they were there, and the students were frustrated and would often go on strikes because of these issues. How did some Koreans respond to Japan's war with China and later with the United States? And the example I want to give you this. So in 1931, Japan seized Manchuria. That same year, this fellow Yi Peng-chong threw a bomb at the Japanese emperor's carriage. He killed some horses but didn't injure the emperor. In 1932, Yoon Bong-gil, notice his name is in bold, he's one of the terms you should remember, he threw a grenade in a park in Shanghai, China not a grenade, it was a bomb shaped like a lunchbox. He's just with a grenade in that picture. And he killed and wounded some Japanese high officials. Right, so he throws this bomb. So do remember him. Now, why would you do this, right? How does killing a few Japanese officials help? You may look at this and say, what's the point? Well, the person who was organizing this was a man named Kim Gu. And the reason he did this was to show the Chinese, who were having really bad relations with Japan and would soon be in a full-scale war with them, that Koreans were also against Japan. And it would be useful if the Chinese supported the Koreans in their struggle against Japan. So by doing this, all of a sudden China gave money to Kim Gu, and he used the money to revive the Shanghai Provisional Government. Right? That government we just talked about, remember, it wasn't going well because they didn't have money. Well, now because of these attacks, the Chinese say, hey, these Koreans will fight our enemy. We should support them. The Chinese gives him money. He uses it to revive the Shanghai Provisional Government, and he establishes a liberation army. Right? And his goal was to have that liberation army help to liberate Korea, so that way Koreans could say, we liberated ourselves. That doesn't happen, right? And that weakens Korea's position later on. How did Japan try and control Koreans? What could Koreans be punished for? How were they punished? So basically what happened, they tried to control Koreans by forcing them to speak Japanese, by increasing censorship. And then after they used censorship very severely, they just said, okay, no more Korean newspapers at all, so we don't even need to worry about that. All associations, Korean independent associations, were gotten rid of. And if you wanted to have any kind of association, like if you wanted to have a club for, to study language or something like that, it had to be an official government club, right? You couldn't have a club independent from the government. Even churches, all the Protestant churches were forced to unite into one big church. And Japan even organized Koreans into neighborhood patriotic associations, which were basically a way of spying on each other, right? You may remember that guy who got in trouble because he had buried his brass when the Japanese government said you have to give it to the government. He buried it at night. Someone informed on him. Well, it was probably someone from the Patriotic Association, because if that would have been found out, they would have gotten in trouble too. And I gave you some examples of how severe this was, right? One guy just said, ask a friend, what would happen if China pushed Japan out of the peninsula? He got 10 months in prison. Some students wrote an anti-Japanese message on a chalkboard. Their teacher was put in jail for 2 years. Even though the teacher wasn't directly linked, the idea is, well, he must have been teaching them this stuff. So he goes to jail. In what different ways did Koreans respond to colonial rule during World War II? Well, one thing that we have to remember is Japan, especially in this time period, had overwhelming power. If you were living in Korea, we talked about how Kim Il-sung resisted, right? He had this, these assassinations and this army. Syngman Rhee used diplomacy. For a long time, Kim Il-sung tried to fight guerrilla war. But if you were in Korea, there wasn't really a whole lot you could do overtly. If you spoke out against Japan, you were going to go to jail. The idea of trying to raise a guerrilla movement would be foolhardy. It would just be destroyed immediately. So most Koreans just grudgingly obeyed. They didn't like it, but they went along with what Japan asked them to do because they didn't have much of a choice. And you may remember the guy bowing to the Shinto shrine and then cursing under his breath, right? Brave people might passively resist, like the guy who buried his brass rather than giving it to the Japanese. Some Koreans would just say, hey, let's work with Japan. And sometimes they did this for very selfish reasons, because they said, you know what, Japan's powerful, we should just work with the powerful people. But other things they pointed out was that Japan's victory in the war would benefit Korea. If Japan wins the war, at least we're on the winning side. And one thing I want to highlight, it's not just those reasons. This was also a reason, right? This is a national language textbook. They mean Japanese. And Japan was attractive because Japan was modern. Don't you want to work with Japan and join the Japanese army, and you too can fly a plane? And there were Koreans who flied in the Japanese Navy. Japan didn't have a separate Air Force at this time. So there were even some Korean kamikazes. And this was attractive, right? You work with Japan, they're modern, they're advanced, and if they win the war, that's going to help Koreans too, because you guys will be on the winning team. Okay. Real quick, let's do true and false, because I just talked straight for 37 minutes. Let's see. So true or false, Shin Jae-ho was a Korean nationalist who believed that though Korea had lost its body, its soul still loved and could get a new one. True or false? True, that's a true statement. Yu Guan-soon was a young Korean woman who helped lead the March 1st movement. True or false? True, that's true. Cho Man-sik was a communist who saw cultural nationalism as a serious threat to Korea. False, right. He was a cultural nationalist, right? Kim Il-sung was a Korean communist leader who had strong ties to both the Chinese and Soviet communists. True, that is correct. Park Kyung-won was a famous Korean dancer. False. False. What was she? She was a pilot, right? She was a pilot. Chae Sung-hae was a famous Korean dancer who was an expert in traditional and modern dance. That is true. That is true. Son Ki-chung won a gold medal in the Olympics. True. That is true. Yoon Bong-gil was a nationalist known for following peaceful means to obtain Korean independence. False. He's the guy that threw the lunchbox bomb. So he was a nationalist. He didn't believe in peace. Kim Gu was a Korean nationalist who put Korean unification above politics but was later assassinated. True. That is a true statement. Yo Eun-young was a moderate leftist nationalist who the Japanese asked to maintain peace and order following Japan's surrender. That is true. True or false, No-Gun Rhee is the site of a North Korean massacre of South Korean civilians. False. It was an American massacre of South Korean civilians. Dokdo is a Korean island claimed by the Japanese. True. That is a true statement. Cho Pong-am was a communist who assassinated Kim Gu. False, right? Cho Pong-am, remember, he was the guy who led the South Korean land reform, was later falsely accused of being a communist agent and executed. I know I'm going fast, that's why I'm recording it though. You can always listen to it again. Chung Myun was the leader of the Second Republic. True. Park Chung-hee helped overthrow the Second Republic and put South Korea on the road to economic development. True? Okay. So what we'll do, we don't have time to do section 6, I think, so I'll record that later, but we do have time to do section 7. So I'm going to skip 6, move on to 7. I'll just have to do 6 on my own later, and I will get that up there for you. Goodness. Okay. So on section 7, what problems did Syngman Rhee face after the Korean War? What economic and educational policies did he take? How effective were they? So he faced basically 3 problems. Korea was devastated by the war, so he had to rebuild. Right? In addition, though, even if he rebuilt everything, Korea had been poor before the war, so he still had to develop economically, and he had to do all this with a neighbor that had previously tried to invade him. Right? So he had to build up national defense. Early on, 50% of the Korean budget was used for national defense. It's hard to develop your country when you're doing that. Now he's going to focus on using foreign aid to develop his heavy industry and also to develop electricity. Remember, North Korea had most of the electrical plants. So South Korea didn't have enough electricity and also lacked heavy industry. Most of that had been in the north. That doesn't work well. That economic policy, we'll see later why, but this economic policy does not work. This policy was better, though. He did focus on education, right? And the education was not the greatest thing in the world at this time, right? I gave you an example of teachers having, one teacher, 100 students. But that was much better than what they had. And a huge number of Korean students will be educated, where they'll learn basic reading and writing and math. And that's enough to start economic development. And this is successful, right? This is going to lead to an educated population that know enough to be able to engage in developing the economy later on. And one thing I want to point about this was popular. You did not have to force Koreans to support education. Koreans have been longing for more schools for years. It's just under the Japanese colonial period they weren't able to develop them. This was very popular. Koreans were like, yes, school, this is awesome. Koreans love school so much that they have after-school school, right? The students don't love it, the parents do. And this example, I showed you these limits. This is why this economics doesn't work, right? And this is a terrible trade gap. What was the Busan political crisis? Well, Syngman Rhee wanted direct popular elections. One problem he also had was, even though he was president of South Korea, or Republic of Korea, he didn't have a strong political party at this time. He does later. And most of the people who were in the legislature, who were the ones who would technically elect the president, they were not in his political party. So he wanted to have direct elections, right? He didn't want the National Assembly electing the president. He wanted the people directly to elect the president. National Assembly didn't like this because it reduced their power. So what he did was he just arrested anyone who would vote against him, right? And that's why I use this image. These are some of these government officials who were elected officials being arrested and put on buses. Right, that's why I had that image. It's a pretty easy way to win the election, just arrest your opponents and they can't vote. Right, and that's what he did. Now, and in the popular vote, he won like 72%. He won a lot. However, there's going to be growing opposition to him over time, right? From 1945 to 1960, right? He has initially support, but he's going to lose it. One is that there's more freedom in society, so people will challenge him and question doing things like this. The urban population will go way up. Urban people tend to be more critical, tend to be less likely to accept hierarchy, and a lot of the resistance to him came in from the cities. Right? Farmers tend to be more hierarchical and authoritarian. Urban populations weren't. And newspaper circulation went way up. More and more Koreans could read, after all. And newspapers were often critical of him as much as possible. And even when they weren't directly critical, they did remind Koreans that there were democratic ideals that the Republic of Korea should live up to. The United States has elections that are fair. Why don't we? France, Britain have elections that are fair. They're democracies. Why don't we? Right. So for these reasons, there's going to be growing opposition to his rule. Now, so that's why opposition grew. Now, how does he respond? By having increasingly dictatorial actions. He responds with suppression, with oppression, with repression, whatever ession you want to say. So, for example, he does this kind of trick where he drops fractions to make sure he wins a vote, which he probably shouldn't have won. He will have thugs go, or his people with him, under him. It's not clear how much he knew, but they'll have thugs who go out and will intimidate voters and things like that. But despite kind of pulling these kinds of tricks, his actual support continues to go down. Right? So in the 1956 election, even though his opponent died during the election, he only had a 56% voter support, which would be a lot in an American election. It's not much when you already had 72%. And his response to that was to strengthen the national security law, to basically make it illegal to arrest anyone who was critical of the government, to shut down newspapers, to censor newspapers, and this is where he will execute the guy who helped carry out the land reform, Cho Bong-am. Cho Bong-am will be falsely accused of being a communist and executed, despite American protests. The United States will tell Rhee, don't kill this guy. He does it anyway. So you have these kinds of problems. And no one asked questions about these. We did go over these, and make sure, there will be a simple question about the music that we talked about. So we've got a couple more minutes. Does anyone want me to answer any of these? I don't hear a number. You got to tell me if there's one you want. All right, well, we will just stop there. I will get this up